Well, we heard from John, George, and two Pauls. It's time for a little bit of Ringo. This is not a
What's my name?
This was not a situation where Ringo said, "Write me a tune, lads." He had his own. It's kind of like I would almost call it Yellow Submarine Part 2. It's another nautical journey. John affectionately called it a ring-along, sing-along. Some very nimble guitar playing from George, who just shines throughout the album. What do we think about Octopus's Garden?
I think it's absolutely charming. I love the imagery in the lyrics. I mean, you can really visualize what he's singing about. Fits his range very well. And the backing track, of course, is stellar. As you mentioned, George's guitar is great. And I love the outtake that's included where you can, hear, I think it's George, kind of laughing in the beginning. And Ringo is singing and messing up, the lyrics. So, but I mean, they just seem to be having a good time, recording it. The new version too, I mean, there isn't a tremendous amount of difference to me anyway in the remix, but you definitely can hear some of the the sound effects better, and I've just always thought this was absolutely charming and a great showcase for Ringo.
Do you prefer it to Don't Pass Me By?
I know I'm going to get hate mail, but yes.
Yes, I think we might have a consensus on that because I much prefer it.
Good.
I do too. I think musically, it's a little more complex. It's much more fun. As far as talking about the remix, there's some really nice panning going on in the guitars in the stereo mix. The bubble sound effects, Ringo blowing bubbles into the water, are much more prominent. You can really hear them. The piano seems a bit louder. The low notes on the piano, and please forgive the pun because it's not intended, really give the song a little more depth. The remix just gives the song a more multi-layered feel. Interesting note: there's no John on the vocals on this. The backing vocals are George and Paul. The outtake, aside from Ringo flubbing the lyrics, so this is one of the few times that a Beatle track breaking down is because of Ringo.
Right.
It very rarely happens. He said, "What? I came in earlier. You all came late." But aside from that, and some different fills from George, this take 9 could have been the take because it was a really solid take. Also, one of the things I'm noticing in listening to this on parts of "You Never Give Me Your Money," George finally got his call and answer guitar stuff on Abbey Road.
Right. He wanted to do it on "Please Please Me" and "Hey Jude."
Wanted it on "Please Please Me," on "Hello Goodbye." He wanted it.
Right, yeah.
He wanted it on "Hey Jude." He finally gets it on the Abbey Road album.
One thing that I learned from the book, apparently in Ringo's earliest drafts of the lyrics, it wasn't all about being under the sea. He also had a section that was up a tree. He was going to be under the sea or up a tree, as a getaway, and he dropped the tree part and then decided to stay underwater. I don't want to diss Ringo at all, but can we honestly say that the album would suffer that much from the absence of Octopus's Garden?
Absolutely. Every Beatle album needs a Ringo song.
Right.
It needs one.
But it doesn't have to be that one.
What else could there be? There wasn't any other. And I think Octopus's Garden is a great little record.
Well, Yellow Submarine kind of had like a children's sing-along feel to it, and Octopus's Garden sort of does too. I mean, that's one of the early songs I played for my own kids to get them interested in the Beatles.
Absolutely. Honestly, I can't picture Abbey Road without it.
As I said earlier, they should have put Octopus's Garden as the lead track, and Ringo should have mentioned Jesus.
But yeah, I have to agree with Scott that I can't imagine Abbey Road without Octopus's Garden because you have to have a Ringo song, and this is, in my opinion, by far the best one that I mean, and I'm saying one that he wrote. I mean, Yellow Submarine was wonderful, of course, and he did some other fun vocals on some tracks, but this one, I just think, as Scott just said, it's a solid record. It's a great production, wonderful lyrics. As I said, just vivid pictures. fits Ringo's personality, vocal range, everything perfectly. I've always been a fan.
It sounds more like a band production to me. You can tell that George and Paul are involved. And, Don't Pass Me By's got a fiddle. You don't have many fiddlers on Beatle tracks. And it's got a sort of like plodding rhythm. And it sounds like it could have just been Ringo and some other guys. But this just sounds like them having a good old session and doing their bubble sounds and doing their...
Right.
And it's very lighthearted lyrics. I remember in the Let It Be movie, George smiling as Ringo sings the words about "I like to be under the sea in an octopus's garden in the shade," and then George looks up and smiles at George Martin and all those guys. As you said, it's adorable, it's cute, it's silly, and you need moments like that.
Dan, you literally just hit the nail on the head. It sounds like the band having a good time.
Yeah,
and that's exactly what the point of these sessions were.
Right.
That was the intent of what Get Back was. It was supposed to be the guys getting back to their roots and having fun playing music, and it turned into a great big ball of shit. But Octopus's Garden, it was these guys playing together as a band, having fun and enjoying themselves and enjoying the music. And forgive my saying this, even though it's a Ringo song, it really sounds like that's what's happening. They're having fun.
To sort of summarize it, the track shows that they didn't always take themselves too seriously. They're happy to do a song like this. They're happy to put it in amidst the proper Lennon and McCartney compositions. And yeah, Ringo had his fans and he always got his moment. I think he sort of went out on a high mark in terms of writing and singing. I mean, it certainly wasn't a step backwards. But I sort of tossed out, would Abbey Road miss it if this wasn't on there? To spark the very conversation we just had, where you rushed to Ringo's defense, and I agree with all your points.
You can also hear how much work. I mean, John is obviously playing on the backing track.
Yeah.
But while he's not doing the vocals, but you can hear that Paul and George and John, they're really giving their all to make the track great.
Well, you've mentioned John a few times now, and as we close out side one, he's going to get the last word. Interestingly, he also gets the first word. He gets Come Together, and he departs on what is the Beatles' longest song. Technically, it's not longer than Revolution Number 9, but that's a collage of tape loops. In terms of
technically, Revolution 9 is not a song.
Exactly, yeah. But so this is at 7 minutes and 47 seconds. It's the longest. But yeah, I mean, we spoke earlier about the lyrics on Come Together. This is the most ultra simple lyrics I guess John ever did. I want you so bad. And interestingly, this isn't like, it's in the 50s and I'm John Lennon learning how to write a song. He's already written, crazy, great, brilliant lyrics, and he decides this time around, it's like we spoke about with the White Album with Your Blues. He said, I'm ready to do a blues song. He went with this. Great feel in the rhythm section with Ringo's drumming, Paul's bass playing, rhythm and lead guitar, great. Keys, great. We'll get to Billy Preston, of course. We haven't really spoken about Yoko very much, but, she is the subject of this. We've mentioned the Moog, and yet another application of it, the white noise. I have a lot to say about I Want You, She's So Heavy, but let's pass it over to Kit.
Well, this is a song that has really grown on me over time. I mean, the first time I heard it when I was, getting into the Beatles in the 80s, this was not a song that immediately resonated with me. And then, of course, the white noise overtaking the music at the end, just didn't get it. It just didn't. But, of course, over the years, and particularly after learning more about Yoko and the art movement that she was involved in, and the white noise kind of makes more sense when you learn about, how she was involved in sort of the noise music, John Cage and so forth. So, her fingerprints are all over this song in that sense. But it's more of a, as you said, Dan, it's less of, the lyrics are very simple, but he's sort of creating a mood here. You can really sense he's, in the throes of passion with Yoko and their, romance isn't, it's been a couple of years, I guess, since they met. And so they're clearly still in that, I don't know if honeymoon stage is the way to put it, but you can really hear the passion and the, and the fact that the white noise sort of overtakes at the end, takes the music. It's sort of an expression of, the emotion and all sort of overtaking him. And I really think that it benefits. I Want You, She's So Heavy benefits greatly from the remix. For me, this was just I love how John's voice is higher up in the mix. You can hear Billy Preston's organ much more clearly. I also like the white noise. Doesn't completely overtake the music on this version. You can still hear it. I just think and you guys can probably speak about this much better than I can, more technically, but it just seems like somehow the white noise and the backing track and all are just more balanced now. It doesn't sound as I don't know, harsh, the white noise. And also I never noticed, I could hear some yelling and some extra piano right before, the music and the white noise cuts off, which I'd never noticed before. Right. So I just, and the ending jam, just sounds even more foreboding, than the original. So for me, this remix brings some added life to the song.
And furthermore to that, there is a sessions track that gives you the recording without any white noise. So you've got both. You have the version that Kit's talking about, which is the remix of the song, and then also, hey, let's listen to Billy Preston jam on the organ, because they must have known that the freaky white noise was off-putting to some people. It's literally noise. So they said, well, let's take it out, and that was a great... you try to think, what extras can you get for Abbey Road? What can they really do? That was that was a great idea.
The Billy Preston Goes Crazy mix.
And I just, to me, that alone was worth the price of admission. I loved hearing that.
Definitely one of my favorite things on the set.
For sure.
But fuzz bass. Paul's playing fuzz bass again. Blistering organ parts, especially on that early mix, which is just incredible. To the point where they were playing so loud that in a soundproof building, they were getting complaints from people outside because it was too loud. Lyrics are incredibly simple, but it's a vocal tour de force, and that blood-curdling scream from John at that last verse is just sick. The harmonies on this remix are soaring, and they're panned left and right.
Yes.
Which really gives a really neat widescreen radio effect. I think the new mix just fits together really well. And with the white noise, if we talked about Revolution 9, if Revolution 9 made you feel like the end of the world was coming, this confirms that the end of the world is here.
Or at least the end of the Beatles.
And I think, and with this being the end of side one, I needed a break. If I was a smoker, I would have needed a cigarette at that point.
There was a debate as to which side should be side one and side two. So for a while, that would have been that abrupt, scary ending would have been the end of the album. And if you recall in the White Album, when they scared everybody with Revolution number 9, then they Disneyfied it with Goodnight. So everybody could it's going to be okay, everybody. Don't worry. Well, I think we handled side one pretty well. We will metaphorically, mentally flip the album over. And for everybody who was scared by Revolution number 9 and then got Goodnight, now who everybody was scared by She's So Heavy gets Here Comes the Sun. And my first comment about Here Comes the Sun, when I listen to it, I don't think to myself, oh, this is one of George's best songs. I don't even think, oh, this is one of the Beatles' best songs. I think this is one of these best songs I've ever heard in my life by anybody. I just love Here Comes the Sun. And I think it's a big part of the reason that Abbey Road is such a giant seller.
Yeah, and in fact, I think it was when they first the Beatles first hit streaming media. I'm not sure, but I think that may have been "Here Comes the Sun," the number one most streamed Beatles song. I'm not sure. I could be hallucinating this, but I think I read that, or if it wasn't number one, it was like top 5.
Because young millennials or whatever the current young people are, they connect with it because it's so appealing and welcoming. And of course, every other generation who was a Beatles fan loves it too. And people talk so much about Something because it's such a beautiful recording and everything. And of course, in Anthology, George Martin said the first thing George wrote that just really blew him away, which is interesting because George had done so much great stuff by then. What are you talking about, George Martin? But he said Here Comes the Sun was the one that he was like, whoa. I mean, and it's probably at that moment, I guess what he meant was, okay, George is John and Paul's equal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it has it all, stunningly, beautiful lyrics, the arrangement, the production. I mean, it's perfect. I mean, it's absolutely stellar. What's interesting too is when you hear the on the sessions disc, they have another take on there. I'm just scrolling down. I forget which number. Oh, here it is. Take 9.
Yep.
The vocal on that George did. I mean, that was almost as good as the final. I mean, you could almost have put that on the final version. So it just shows, how George really knew, kind of like what we were talking about with Paul and how he could visualize exactly how he wanted the songs to sound. You could really hear on that take that George already had in place exactly how he wanted this to sound. And I like on this remix that you can hear the Moog better. I mean, you can, it was very subtle before, and now you can hear it quite a bit more. And the keyboards in general, but particularly the Moog. I mean, this is an absolute classic, standout.
Well, think about how the Moog was used on the previous track with the white noise. It kind of shows the versatility of that instrument.
That's true.
And the Beatles used it with restraint and impeccable taste. I mean, every time they used it in a different way. It's different on Maxwell. It's different on I Want You. It's different on Here Comes the Sun. One thing I have to say before we pass it to Scott, I keep talking about George's written lyrics. There's John and Paul stuff in there too, but I always gravitate to George's. Here's what he wrote. He wrote, "Here comes the sun, Scooby-Dooby."
Yeah.
I love that was his original content. Of course, it became do-do-do-do. And at the very end of the lyrics, he drew a sun with a smiley face.
Oh,
Definitely thinking of Frank Sinatra there. Here comes the sun, Scooby-Dooby. Here comes that sun, and I say it's okay, Jack.
Hey, Jack.
That's right.
Yeah. Here comes the sun. After the world ending with I Want You, She's So Heavy. We flip the record over, and all is right with the world again. Mm-hmm. The acoustic guitar on the left here, you hear the synth panning from the left to the right. The orchestra is really nicely, it's way more pronounced. The harmonies enfold you like a hug.
Yeah.
It's very comforting after the chaos of I Want You. And really pay attention to the synth part on the last chorus in the left. Really cool. On the outtake, it's a very stripped down. It's just the acoustic guitar and drums and some bass. But what's really neat on that for me was listening to Ringo getting acquainted with the 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 with that part, and how he's trying to figure out what he's doing, and how each time it comes around he's adding a little more to it and getting the fills. Mm-hmm. I really dig that early take just for that, just to hear Ringo getting acquainted with it and how he builds the fills, and then when they went for the final take next time around, I think.
The book points out something that hadn't really occurred to me. That is the Indian influence. That is, the Indian music with the unusual time signatures. And you would never listen to Here Comes the Sun and go, oh, this is Indian music. Never would you think that. But the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, if you take the melody away, it's Indian thing. And again, maybe not necessarily an obvious album opener because it's low key again. Yes, in the context of the closer side 1, this is another one that could have closed an album. It would have been a happy note to go out on a different album. It's nice. George has track 2 on side 1 and track 1 on side 2. And again, an acknowledgement by the Beatles that he was kicking ass. Really, my biggest regret when I listen to Here Comes the Sun is I don't hear John's voice. Paul is credited as backing vocal. I don't really hear him either.
John's not on the track at all.
I know this, but what I'm saying is my regret is that when I hear the chorus and it sounds like George harmonizing with himself as he would in his solo career, how great would it be if Here Comes the Sun was equal parts George, Paul, and John, like, Nowhere Man or something. The song deserved it, but it just makes it sound more like a George solo recording. It would have sounded more like a Beatle recording, similar to when we talked about the earliest version of Goodnight on the White Album, where it sounded like the whole band was saying goodnight instead of just Ringo saying goodnight.
Yeah.
This is George saying Here Comes the Sun. It could have been, Paul and John.
But like I said, John for, again, whatever reason, John wasn't involved in this track at all. Was it because of the car accident? Was it just, it's another George song, I don't feel like being involved?
I would hope not. If he knew what it was, I would hope not, because he should have recognized what a great track it was. What a great composition it was.
Yeah, but you know what? George had been writing great songs all along.
That's true.
And John didn't care.
Or maybe he was just like, he was egotistical and he didn't want his little brother to be on his level.
Right.
Well, that's another part of it. Another thing I thought about just now, in just listening to the optimism and the feeling and the positive vibe of the song itself, after the misery and yes, I don't care. I really don't care what the other historians and people have to say about the Get Back sessions and how it wasn't all misery and happiness. It was a lot of misery and a lot of darkness. And, to have George write such a happy, uplifting song coming off of how really dark a lot of the January 69 stuff was, it really does feel like it's like a new beginning and a new start. And at least for George, whether or not that meant continuing on with the group or whether it meant burgeoning off into a solo career.
You know what just occurred to me? It never occurred to me before. What if on this album, the Ringo song had been Old Brown Shoe? George had given that song and Ringo sang that. I could picture him singing Old Brown Shoe. And George would have had 3 representations, and it would have been the first time on a Beatle album that, the song for Ringo was written by someone other than Lennon and McCartney. Just an idea I just had at this moment, but it was up-tempo and everything. Because my thought was, I mentioned earlier George had a ballad, and he had a mid-tempo acoustic thing.
Yeah, you know what? I kind of like that the idea of Ringo singing Old Brown Shoe.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Octopus's Garden could have been the B-side of Ballad of John and Yoko.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, the second song on the side is a ballad. On side 1, it was Something. On side 2, it's Because. Very prominent electric harpsichord. We haven't really heard harpsichord since Piggies, I don't think.
George Martin playing on this one.
Yeah, he was. Basically, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played sideways. It's basically just a C-sharp minor arpeggio. It doesn't really belong to anybody. Very lush vocal sound. Honestly, with a sort of, sort of philosophical lyrics and sort of a sense of finality in retrospect. Because the sky is blue, it makes me cry, with a double meaning of blue. And again, another innovative usage of the Moog synthesizer. I mean, you already have a harpsichord, but the the synth solo, which is basically a restatement of the melody, another usage of it. Now, on Anthology, they gave us the a cappella vocals. So what they're doing here is the reverse. They're giving us the karaoke. They've taken the vocals out and you just hear the backing track.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Because has always been not only one of my favorite songs off of Abbey Road, but one of my favorite Beatles songs, period. The harmonies are impeccable. I mean, they are absolutely impeccable. You can tell they worked on this very, very diligently. And it's interesting to have that alternate take, the instrumental, mainly, on the Sessions disc. And it's interesting, you can hear, I guess it's Ringo, I'm not sure, doing that clapping. Yep. That's really interesting to hear, him keeping the tempo steady. And as you said, Dan, I like how they did clarify the Moog. This is an ongoing theme on this show, but it's just amazing. Now we can fully appreciate what a huge role the Moog played on Abbey Road, and here's another example. It's a stunning track.
I can see why it would be a personal favorite. It's almost like angels singing. It's almost like you woke up on a cloud in heaven and there was some angels singing. I mean, really, and this is one where we talked about the raw, direct lyrics of I Want You and that sort of like throwaway goofiness of Come Together. This is one where the style of the lyrics really fits the style of the music. It's a high point for John on this album, I feel.
Absolutely, and I mean the lyrics, the words, I mean they just perfectly match. They fit the harmonies. I mean they just work so well.
I love this song. I have always loved this song. Every version of this song, every incarnation has just made me weep. This remix just absolutely floored me. I think the instrumental mix is incredible. The outtake is fantastic. Just hearing the piano and the guitar and the bass, and hearing Ringo as click track. Mm-hmm. His tempo is rock steady.
Okay, well, listen, it's time for the long one.
That's what she said. So
we've had a pretty long break between Paul songs, if you think about it. It's been a while since we had a Paul one. So we're going to come into You Never Give Me Your Money. I was never quite sure where the medley technically began. I guess it would be You Never Give Me Your Money because it's reprised a couple times. More lush harmonies. I mean, I love the vocal harmonies. We just came out of Because, which obviously is beautiful, but the harmonies in You Never Give Me Your Money also beautiful. The chord progression that Paul uses dates back to Vivaldi. Classical composers use it all the time. Let's get Kit's thoughts about You Never Give Me Your Money.
Well, I mean, this is another case where the remix, it's not going to completely knock you out, in terms of anything super new. What? I mean, I didn't find it that, the bass, and it's a fuller sound. But other than that, I mean, it just didn't, it was great, but it just didn't really knock me out the way I Want You, She's So Heavy did, that remix. I mean, it's a great remix, don't get me wrong. It just didn't hit me. Like I Want You, She's So Heavy did in terms of being really different. But, I mean, I love it. Don't get me wrong. And it's interesting to hear the Take 36, I think it is, on the Sessions disc, where the vocal from Paul on that one is not, but I think he was just sort of rehearsing. I don't think it was meant to be as great as it was on the final version. But I thought it was kind of amusing that... toward the beginning, I think I'm not sure if that's Paul singing it. Where a little bit of Peggy Lee. All right, okay, you win. I'm in love with you. I thought.
That's Paul doing one of his other voices.
Yes, that's what I thought. Yeah, I was pretty sure that was Paul, but I wasn't 100% certain. So that was kind of fun to hear, just hearing him work it out. But yeah, I mean, it's as you said. I think you said, Dan. Beautiful chord changes. I've always loved the chord changes on it. It also is a little bit like Ballad of John and Yoko, although not as straightforward, describing what was going on at the time, business-wise, and wanting to escape.
Some things in the remix. Yeah, you're right. This isn't really a drastic remix. There is some added presence on the double tracking of Paul's vocals. The punch has a lot more bass. You can hear each note clear. The first half of the guitar solo before the One Sweet Dream section seems a little bit buried, but I noticed the offbeat tambourine just before the crossfade for the first time, and the sound effects during the crossfade between that and Sun King. There's some really cool stereo imaging going on that stuff.
I agree with that. The sound effects, they really show up much more on this remix.
Well, when we were speaking about the White Album, Scott and I spoke about Happiness is a Warm Gun. And to me, that's kind of a precursor. And one thing I hadn't thought about is You Never Give Me Your Money is kind of a Happiness is a Warm Gun. Happiness is a Warm Gun had 3 parts. It had She's Not a Girl Who Misses Much. It had I Need a Fix Because I'm Going Down. It had, the doo-wop part at the end. And also some Mother Superior Jump the Gun, which we couldn't figure out what the hell that was. Mm-hmm. And You Never Give Me Your Money, it has the mellow part with all the sort of, talk about a clue to the future of the Beatles. I mean, you never give me this, you never give me that. A lot of resignation in the lyrics. After that, he's got the Out of College Money Spent, and he's got the One Sweet Dream. There were literally 3 different songs Paul was working on. John also did it in Happiness is a Warm Gun, and we mentioned it sort of getting ahead of ourselves on the White Album one. Maybe John didn't warm up to the medley because he was kind of like, well, I've already done that. That's what Happiness is a Warm Gun was. It didn't occur to me that the Abbey Road medley starts out with a sort of a mini medley.
Yeah, I never thought of the song as being kind of a mini medley in itself, but I mean, that's a really interesting way to look at it because, yeah, you do have the different parts. You have that kind of the slow, mellow, and kind of tinged with sadness, and then you get, Out of College Money Spent, a kind of a little bit more of a, boy, I wish things were back, were simpler, a bit of a simpler time. We may not have had a lot of money then, but boy, things were much easier. And then, of course, but oh, that magic feeling, Nowhere to Go. And again, it's just sort of looking back to another time. So while they may have been pieces that Paul was writing and putting them together, they make sense. There is kind of a storyline there. But I really, that's a really interesting way I'm putting it, that the song is a mini medley. I never really thought about that.
I think of it more like a little mini opera along the lines of A Quick One by The Who.
Yeah, well, further underscoring that point, what they did after You Never Give Me Money is they did 6 songs as 2-song medleys, meaning they literally recorded Sun King straight into Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam straight in. So this one they didn't need to because it was already kind of like 3 things in one.
Right, exactly,
but one thing I learned from the book is, I always thought Magic Feeling, Nowhere to Go meant, you don't have any obligations, you have freedom and everything. But his original lyric, he had a K in front of it, like I know where to go. And I never picked up on that double meaning, and he intended it to be a double meaning. Because when you hear the album, and we haven't made this point, there were no lyrics included. So Sgt. Pepper, they stuck them right on the album cover. White Album, they gave it to you on a poster. And there's some great lyrics on this album. They just, they wanted to put a picture of the wall with some lady in a blue dress walking by out of focus. I don't know what the thinking was in this time, but... so this is what I said earlier about you still can pull little nuggets out of here. Because now when I listen to the song, I'll think, what a magic feeling. I know where to go. Like, I know what I'm doing. I had always thought, there's nowhere to go. I can lay on the couch and be a bum. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, because I also remember, I think in past interviews that Paul used to say he was also thinking in the medley about, how he and Linda would just jump in the car and just go, would just drive. But also, I've thought of it as well in this one that, that magic feeling, nowhere to go. And so there, and maybe that's why, one of the reasons why the lyrics aren't on the back or in a poster or whatever, that, there are multiple ways that you can interpret these lyrics. And as you said, that's one of the reasons why we keep talking about them, right? Because we're always learning new things and new ways to interpret the words.
Any closing thoughts for you on You Never Give Me Your Money, Scott, before we go into Sun King?
Like I said, I consider it, like I said, like almost like a mini opera. But as far as it being like 3 unfinished songs strung together, McCartney's kind of made a career off of that. Backseat of My Car, Band on the Run, and more recently, Despite Repeated Warnings. He's kind of been doing that for a long time. But one thing I absolutely just went nuts over on the Out of College Money Spent, the backing vocals that are in there. Oh my God.
Yeah, I made a note of that. Well, to me, the most sort of pepperish moment is the transition into Sun King because it's sort of done with crickets and sound effects. And, most of the album doesn't really make me think of Pepper. And it's interesting to think of how, like, album covers affect your experience because Pepper had the colorful album cover. White Album had nothing, and this has, the crosswalk picture, and it just makes them all feel so separate. But we mentioned on the White Album, on Pepper and the White Album, they rated the sound effects thing. Maybe they burned themselves out on it because there's less of that on Abbey Road, or maybe it's because they were trying to make the Moog do all the different sounds. But they occasionally did use sound effects, and the crickets. I guess the book tells you exactly what reel 23 jungle sounds that came from. Don't need that much detail. Everybody always comments how there's I think it's brain damage on Dark Side of the Moon. When people hear Sun King, even though Sun King came first by 4 years, people think of Pink Floyd when they hear that arpeggio with the Leslie speaker, because of course Alan Parsons was at both sessions. He was working on this and he was working with Floyd, and everybody comments that they always expect like Dave Gilmour's voice to come in or something on Sun King.
Well, and of course, with Sun King, we can mention the shall we say, distinct similarities between this and Fleetwood Mac's Albatross. It's certainly unmistakable. But still, this has always been a favorite of mine off of Abbey Road. I think this is just such a distinct kind of sound. I mean, and the again, just like on Because, the harmonies, the tight harmonies are just a wonder to behold. And I also in this remix, not only as we talked about earlier that the sound effects really come through more, there was an organ part I'd never noticed before, right before they go into the pseudo foreign language section, toward the end. There was a little organ part. I'm like, wow, I've never noticed that before. So the remix certainly did clarify certain areas. But I just have always thought this was just a eerie kind of track. Always enjoyed it.
John seems to be good at creating those sort of unique moods in his solo career as well. Thinking Number 9 Dream or something. It's so funny because the three things you just said were literally the next three things on my outline. I wrote down the lush harmonies continue. I mean, we had Because, You Never Give Me Your Money, and now Sun King, more lush harmony. Next thing I wrote was Billy Preston's organ, much more prominent in the mix. And then I mentioned the foreign language section they call Spanish, random Spanish words. It always sounded more Italian to me for some reason.
Yeah.
And also, before we turn over to Scott, in the book, John kept mentioning, unfinished songs and being able to, quote, get rid of them. Like Sun King and some of the other ones coming up. He hadn't finished writing the lyrics, and he kind of liked that idea. Now, what I'm wondering is how much we're balancing the medley idea with an artistic consideration and how much we're balancing it with a deadline. Well, the album needs to be finished by this date. Oh, if we do this medley and we slap that together, we don't need to finish writing these songs. Because I'm sure it was both things, as opposed to, no, listen, we haven't really done something like this before. Because, a lot of these songs are represented by 1 minute, meaning, they would have gone to another couple verses, maybe a solo section, maybe a chorus. And, it was something they agreed on. But then again, famously, there's been a little bit of debate because apparently Paul loved the idea. John wasn't quite so sure. He wanted individual songs. So let's have Scott comment on that.
Oh, good Lord. It's hard to say. I think I'm really not sure where to go with this. I mean,
what you're saying is you've got nowhere to go.
These guys, it was the Beatles. Was there a deadline, or could they have set their own deadline at this point? Was John soured on the idea because it wasn't his idea?
There's always that.
I mean, it's hard to say. Whatever it was, they took these bits of songs and turned it into a flippin' masterpiece,
I believe the main thing a label in those days would pressure you for was to have something ready by Christmas.
Right.
And so I'm trying to think. This was kind of recorded in the spring and the summer. I honestly feel like there was a benefit to each. If they do the medley, it's kind of a rationalization, I guess. John goes, "Oh, good, I don't have to write any more lyrics." And then the benefit to fleshing the songs out as we get to these songs, some were maybe more short-changed, some maybe work well as a short thing that pops in and out. Speaking of which, let's talk about Mean Mr. Mustard. That is the next thing that follows Sun King. It's 1:05. We've heard it on the Esher demos. It's been around. Interesting thing for me is everybody knows that the sister's name was changed to Pam because of the medley. I thought he was saying his sister Shelley, like Shelley Long. Apparently he was saying his sister Shirley, like Shirley Jones, but his pronunciation of Shirley, his sister Shelley, sounded like Shelley to me. I guess it's the English accent. The groove sounds like the word from Rubber Soul to me, that bum, 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 ba, 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 ba. Kind of chord changes are a little different, but what's a song you wrote for Ringo? I'm the Greatest?
Yes.
Also similar to this, I felt. So we'll get to the story of it later, but how do you feel about Mean Mr. Mustard?
I didn't get a chance to really talk about my take on Sun King. We forgot about that. As far as, real quick, Sun King, I really like the back and forth stereo panning of the guitar at the beginning, and like Kit mentioned, the organ is really clear. I had always heard the organ, but it's really there now, and you did mention the harmonies. On take 20, there's some really nice interplay between John and George's guitars that I never noticed before. And John's guide vocal is just really barely audible, but the backing track is really gorgeous, is really dreamy. Mean Mr. Mustard, the remix, there's more fuzz bass, which I love. I love fuzz bass. Tambourine is really nice and clear. There's a really nice piano in the right channel. There's some subtle panning on the harmonies with Paul in the left channel, John in the right, especially on the Dirty Old Man section. On take 20, there's early vocals. Yes, John is singing his sister Shirley. On the Get Back versions and on the Esher demo, I also thought it was his sister Shelley. Mm-hmm. So it might have gone from his sister Shelley to his sister Shirley to his sister Pam. The outtake version, take 20, also has the original ending chord.
Right. Yeah.
Which got lopped off by mistake. Or is it by mistake? We'll see.
Yep. Yeah, I enjoy Take 20 because, again, this is another theme of this show. We've talked about how they, you can hear that they seem to be having a good time. in the studio. And there's with Take 20, there's kind of a jokey sort of lead vocal from John, and for some reason says "God Save the Queen" numerous times, and it's it's funny. I mean, he's having clearly having fun recording it. I'm really glad that Scott mentioned all the different the subtle elements of the remix, because this was another one that for me it was very subtle. The remix, the changes are very subtle to the point where again it didn't leap out at me. I mean the differences definitely were more subtle on this one, but it's great. It's I've always loved John's lead vocal on this. I mean it sounds almost, I don't know, nasty. He really it's sort of stressing the sort of dark humor of the song, and saying the dirty old man. I mean, I just always thought his vocals on this were just perfectly suited to the mood of the song, and kind of looking back to the kind of dark sense of humor that he had that you could read in his books, or I mean, it's classic John.
Well, maybe I'm too literal of a person. I hate to nitpick the lyrics, but again, if you stop and think about some of the stuff, if you sleep in the road, you're not going to do that too many times. Someone's gonna run you over, man.
Not if you're sleeping in a hole in the road.
Yeah, I guess so.
Because then you're sleeping in the indentation where the cars can just travel over you.
But the one that really gets me is that takes him out to look at the Queen. Only place that he's ever been. I mean, he's a mean old man. He's an old man, and he's only been one place.
But I had to pull out my guitar, my acoustic guitar, because we're going to talk about something now. I mentioned we get the final chord.
Yep.
Because there was a part of the medley which was there because John mentioned takes him out to look at the Queen. So Paul thought we need to have something about the Queen. Mm-hmm. And what we have in this is in the end of Me, Mr. Mustard, we've got that such a Danny old man. Danny old man. And that's where it ends. Mm-hmm. It ends on a D chord. So what Paul did was decided to go, and as part of the medley, Paul came up with this little ditty, Her Majesty, where the first chord of Her Majesty is actually, it's a D. And he goes, Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. So the idea is that we would go, in the medley, we'd go, such a Danny old man. Danny old man. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. And then we get to the end of the song. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl. Someday I'm going to make her mine. Oh, yeah. Someday I'm going to make her mine. But in the course of the medley, the reason we only have the A as the last note of Her Majesty is it got chopped off when they cut Her Majesty out of the medley because it didn't fit. It's kind of like putting a slow melody in the middle of a blazing rock concert, a slow ballad in the middle of a blazing rock concert. It grinds the flow to a screeching halt.
A momentum killer.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. And that's what Her Majesty would have been in the melody. So this final note, this someday I'm going to make a mine. Oh, yeah. Someday I'm going to make a mine. Is what we were supposed to have. So we were supposed to go from Her Majesty right into Polythene Pam. And you'll get to hear that on the long one. It's definitely a momentum killer, but it's still kind of cool to hear it as it was originally intended.
So it took 50 years for Beatle fans to be able to hear that chord, apart from bootlegs. Yes. Well, that shows that the wisdom of doing the long one edit, because that was clearly the main takeaway. And again, we haven't gotten to it, though we're getting close. Paul told the guy to just get rid of it. And no, you're not supposed to do that with Beatles. You're not supposed to get rid of stuff. I mean, it was like the EMI rule or something. That's why he didn't want to displease Paul, but he also didn't want to get in trouble, so he just stuck it at the end.
It wasn't just with the Beatles. It was just EMI policy. Yeah. You never throw anything away. Right. So they just it was like 15 seconds or 17 seconds of leader tape. At the end of the reel, they just tacked it on. And when they were cutting a reference acetate to listen back, they just let the tape play when they were cutting the thing. And when they were when Paul or whoever, or John or whatever, was listening to their reference acetate, they thought it was over, and then like 17 seconds of silence go by, and you hear the final chord of Polythene Pam leading into Her Majesty, and there it was, and they were like, "Oh, this is cute. We'll leave it on there." And it was to the point where they didn't even realize it was on there, which is why the first pressings of the album, it's not listed on the label or the cover.
Another interesting thing about Her Majesty, which we're going to completely cover before we get to it, apparently, is
Right.
I actually always heard it as I've got to get her belly full of wine. And later in life, I've got to get a belly full of wine. He's talking about himself needing to drink some alcohol to build up his nerve. At first, I thought he was like going to get the queen drunk. Or Her Majesty didn't necessarily have to be the queen. It could have been a princess, too. But one last thought on Mustard before we go into Pam. I mentioned the songs being incomplete. Another nice thing from the book, he had started another verse. His mother, Charlie. So we've got, his sister, Shelley, Shirley, Pam, whatever her name is. Then the first line of the next verse was going to be his mother, Charlie, works at the, and he might have wrote bank. I can't really read his writing, so it might have been his mother, Charlie, works at the bank. Da, 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 da. So I honestly don't think Mean Mr. Mustard suffers much from not being fleshed out as a complete song. But my segue into Polythene Pam, I think that one kind of does. I would have liked to heard Polythene Pam as like a good 2.5, 3 minute jam. And since, Scott's brought his guitar into this, one thing I always wondered about Polythene Pam is those big chords, why they were done acoustically, because it sounds like a perfect dun, 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 distorted guitar thing. And apparently it was a partial influence of The Who and Pinball Wizard, which does start with that acoustic guitar. And my ear hadn't really picked it out. Apparently it's a 12-string that John's playing. Do you think that maybe, just like Her Majesty slowed things down, do you think that maybe, Scott, the distortion would have been too extreme and they went with acoustic instead?
I think it's just a matter of remember, it's coming out of, Polythene Pam is supposed to be coming out of Your Majesty. So when you're coming off of that D major chord at the end of Her Majesty that gets cut off because it's actually overlapping with the first chord of Polythene Pam, so you're getting those acoustic guitar chords blending with the final chord of Her Majesty, and then you have the stabbing electric guitar answering it. So you got dun 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 ba-dum, ba-dum. So it fits. And it makes more sense with Her Majesty in the middle of Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam,
right.
From a technical standpoint. But again, from a flow, it just doesn't work, and it's kind of eh.
That would have been a pretty jarring transition to just go, from Her Majesty to full out, electric guitar. I agree.
Yeah, in the context of the medley, it softens it up and helps it squeeze between the other songs. But in the context of a standalone, like, for example, if it had been a White Album track, it would have been a great White Album track. If it would have just started out, down, down, just like, Helter Skelter, Revolution single, everybody's got something to hide. They're not averse to using distorted guitar. And those three chords just seem to be begging out, bam, bam, bam. It doesn't sound like an acoustic riff to me, is all I'm trying to say.
Exactly. But remember, think of it in the context of the full medley with Her Majesty in the proper place.
Yeah, and you made that point. I'm just saying is that in my mind also picks out the tunes individually, because I know I mentioned earlier I'm trying to figure out, was it a compromise to not flesh out these tunes? And for me, like I said, Mean Mr. Mustard, a minute of that is fine with me. That's okay. I don't need to hear about his mother Charlie working at the bank. I would have liked to heard a little bit more about Polythene Pam.
No, I believe me, I get exactly where you're coming from. Yeah. And maybe if John had fleshed out Polythene Pam as a full or longer song, then it might have had a different arrangement had it been a standalone.
Well, having said that, he kind of did, because as we hear from the bonus stuff, he had another verse about being a little absurd, that she's a nice class of bird. So he had extra lyrics that didn't make it in.
Were those extra lyrics or were those placeholder lyrics for the demo?
John Lennon will never know what he considered a placeholder, and will never know what he considered legit, which makes him such an interesting writer.
I love the outtake. I love take 27. I love John laughing about the drums, going, "Oh, it sounds like Dave Clark."
Right. That was great.
Yeah, that was great.
Those little moments are worth the price of admission, because they're having those conversations all day, every day in the studio, and those are nice to hear.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note on take 27 that he's not using that thick accent that
Oh, yeah.
that he uses in the final recording. And I should give a shout out here to a friend of mine, Karen Duhai, for a good friend of both of ours, who's a linguist. She has her doctorate in linguistics, and she did at this conference I attended a couple of weeks ago a really interesting analysis of the accent that John uses in that, and why, and representing class and so forth. There are different stories about the inspiration for this song. Some of them X-rated, but won't go into them. But it was a woman who supposedly liked eating polythene and perhaps other things she liked to do with it. But in any case, it's kind of this dirty song. I mean, and I think the accent that John uses is sort of to reference Monty Python here, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind
Cheeky.
of. Sort of it. And be a little reminiscent of Maggie May.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's like that. And so it really, I thought that was a particular, because it's great without the accent too, but it just makes it sound even sleazier, and a little more juvenile than perhaps if he had just done it in a straightforward way. But I agree with you, Dan. I could have heard more of this. This could have gone on longer. It's one of my favorite songs off the medley as well. And when they go into the jam, and by the way, I never realized until you hear the long one. There's an edit toward the end when John is yelling. When he says, "Oh, look out." It turns out in the original version or the original edit that he said more stuff. I mean, it was just more yelling and stuff like that, but I didn't know that. What he
Great fab.
Yeah.
It's literally stuff like gear and fab and great.
Never noticed that.
It's just encouraging. It's again having fun with the track and enjoying themselves.
And in fairness, the transition from Polythene Pam and She Came In Through the Bathroom was very dramatic, very cool. And as I said, they considered it a 2-song medley, so they always recorded it straight in. And so I do like the transition, and I'm not, again, Monday morning quarterbacking and Sunday driving the Beatles Abbey Road. I'm just saying is, we like to talk about these things and think about things. And we've already spoken about adjusting tunes to fit into this medley. So we have to talk about the tempo of She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, because the anthology told us that they very often played it. She came in through the bathroom window, kind of like sort of more slow.
Yeah, it was slow, little, almost jazzy.
And it ain't slow no more. And I think it benefits from the faster tempo and great vocal by Paul.
This is a great group performance. John is on there. This is a full band performance. This is one of the few songs where it really is all 4 of them really just letting loose.
Absolutely. I think this is just a great rocker. The bass, we've talked a little bit about this, but I think the bass is much higher in this in the mix and in this remix. And the hand clap section to me sounded the clapping noise sounded a little lower in the mix to me. Maybe. But
John's acoustic is really, really aggressive in the early take.
Yes, it sure is, which I like that too.
And the ooh and ah backing vocals on the remix are just wonderful.
Yes.
And for anybody who doesn't know, the title is a reference to a fan breaking into Paul's house when he wasn't home. She literally went in through the bathroom window. Now, I'm feeling, I've been picking on John a little bit for his lyrics. I think he was rubbing off on Paul a little bit. Or maybe it was the deadline again, because there's some suspect lyrics in this song. Is someone who sucks their thumb likely to have their own lagoon? Let's start with that. But before we get to that, I mean, she said she'd always been a dancer. She worked at 15 clubs a day. She wasn't spending much time at each club. One day, 15 clubs. One that I used to think was nonsense, but I thought about it, it actually does have meaning. What does this mean to you guys? She could steal, but she could not rob.
That's actually my favorite line, and actually a line that I love in Beatles lyrics, period, because, it seems like a throwaway at first when you think of it, but you're thinking about, are there, connotations of steal and rob? Are there differences? Is one worse than the other? I mean, are they synonyms? It's hard to say, but yeah, I mean, it in a weird way, it makes sense.
Well, theft and stealing and robbing are actually not interchangeable, and it actually is not even open to interpretation, because my first thought was, well, I think stealing is the owner isn't present. Like, oh, you just find a purse and you steal it, while robbing is, the owner is present, and that takes more nerve. That's why she could steal, but she could not rob. But actually, robbery has one more element, because it also involves the threat of force. And it's actually a more serious crime, robbery, than stealing and basic theft. So when you say she could steal but she could not rob, if the opportunity's there, she'll take something. I guess what he's meaning, I'm realizing this as I say it, Paul wasn't home. So she broke into his house and she could steal, but if he would have been home, she wouldn't have the nerve to rob him.
Interesting.
Wow. Mind blown. Well, my point is, and this is like with John Lennon, John had some lines in Come Together that are great, that have meaning, and then the other ones that are about, feet and knees. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Kit. That's now one of my favorite lines. She could steal, but she couldn't rob, has deep meaning. I mean, that is an insight into a person. I mean, or can you go mug somebody? Probably not. But if you find a car with an open window and an iPod in there, I'm not the type of person who would steal, but I'm definitely not the type of person who would rob. But it's thrown in there with stuff about lagoons, and the book also tells you the line about quitting your job at the police department. Paul was in a cab, and the guy driving the cab used to be a cop, and that was another one so it's a pastiche of real life stuff, like the fan coming in the window, and just what I literally believe are placeholders. I mean, Your Own Lagoon sounds great when he sings it, and he probably thought, good enough, because John was doing it. Why shouldn't Paul?
Yeah.
We haven't heard from Scott. What are your feelings, Scott? Will you rob or steal from us?
No. I said it. Remember, the song is not directly autobiographical. Yes, it's based on somebody who broke into his house, but when you're talking about it in terms of the song, it's fiction. She could have stolen his heart. She could steal, but she couldn't rob. So who knows?